The invitation never came. Not a formal one, anyway. Just a hurried phone call from my youngest sister, Natalie, 3 weeks before what was supposed to be the social event of our family's decade. Her voice was apologetic, but firm, the way people sound when they're delivering bad news they've already made peace with. Sophia, she said, and I could hear her pacing in that nervous way she'd done since childhood. About Veronica's wedding, there's been a situation with the guest list. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A situation. As if my own sister's wedding was a diplomatic crisis that required careful navigation around the inconvenience of my existence. I sat in my temporary quarters at Camp Pendleton, still in my desert camouflage utilities from that morning's training exercise, listening to my baby sister explain how I was being diplomatically uninvited from our family. It's just that Veronica's fiancé, James, comes from this incredibly prominent political family, Natalie continued, her words tumbling together in that breathless way that meant she was reciting a speech someone else had written. The Ashfords have connections everywhere, and the guest list is full of senators, ambassadors, high society people. Mom thinks it might be awkward if you came in your military uniform. The word awkward hit me like a physical blow. 22 years of service to my country, 4 combat deployments, a career that had taken me from a scared 18-year-old Marine recruit to the rank I'd worked blood and tears to achieve, and I was awkward. I was the family's embarrassment, the rough edge that needed to be smoothed away before the important people arrived. Natalie, I said, keeping my voice steady even though something was breaking apart inside my chest. Are you telling me I'm not invited to Veronica's wedding because I'm in the military? The silence stretched between us across 3,000 miles of telephone line. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. It's not that you're not invited exactly. It's just that Mom thinks maybe it would be better if you took some leave time. Came as a civilian. Wore a dress instead of your uniform. I closed my eyes and felt the familiar weight of their judgment settling over me like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't new. This conversation was just the latest verse in a song my family had been singing my entire adult life. The melody had changed over the years, but the lyrics were always the same. Sophia was too much, too intense, too military, too everything they didn't want their carefully curated world to acknowledge. My mother, Patricia Castellano, came from old Florida money, the kind that traced its roots back to Spanish land grants and had weathered every economic storm by simply pretending hardship happened to other people. She measured success in country club memberships and charity board positions and who was photographed with whom at which exclusive event. My father, Vincent, was a successful plastic surgeon who had married into her world and adapted to it with the enthusiasm of a true convert. Together, they had created a bubble of privilege where image was everything and authenticity was a luxury they couldn't afford. Veronica had understood the assignment from birth. She was beautiful in that effortless way that photographed well, charming in conversations that never ventured into uncomfortable territory, ambitious in directions that led to acceptable outcomes. She'd become an interior designer whose client list read like a who's who of Palm Beach society. When she announced her engagement to James Ashford III, heir to a political dynasty that included 2 governors and a Secretary of State, my parents didn't just approve, they practically vibrated with triumphant validation. And then there was me, the anomaly. The daughter who looked at their perfect world and chose something else entirely. Something that required sacrifice instead of privilege, service instead of status, substance instead of surface. Something they embarrassed. The uniform isn't optional, Natalie, I finally said, my voice carrying the edge of authority that came from years of leading Marines in places where hesitation could get people killed.
For a formal evening event, my dress blues are required military protocol. It's not a costume I can take off. It's who I am. But Sophia, you have to understand, no. The word came out harder than I intended, and I heard her sharp intake of breath. You have to understand. I've spent my entire adult life serving this country. I've been shot at in Afghanistan. I've lost friends in Iraq. I've made decisions that kept other people's children alive. I've earned every ribbon on my chest and every star on my collar. And you're asking me to pretend none of that matters because it might make mom's social climbing friends uncomfortable? The tears in Natalie's voice were real when she spoke again. I know how important your career is, but this is Veronica's day, and Mom has already told everyone that you probably won't be able to make it because of military obligations. It's easier this way. Easier. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. It was always easier to erase me than to explain me. Easier to have two successful daughters instead of two successful daughters and one who served. Easier to maintain their perfect narrative than to acknowledge the complicated truth of who I actually was. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my quarters and let the full weight of 22 years crash over me. This wasn't the first time they'd edited me out of their story, just the most blatant. There had been countless Christmas cards sent to extended family with photos that somehow never included me if I was in uniform. Country club conversations where my mother would vaguely mention that I worked for the government before quickly changing the subject to Veronica's latest design project. Family gatherings where my deployment stories were met with uncomfortable silence and rapid subject changes. I remember the last time I'd been home on leave, 18 months earlier. I'd been coming off a particularly brutal deployment to Syria, where I'd led a logistics operation that had been instrumental in evacuating civilians from a collapsing city. The mission had been classified at the time, but the personal cost had been written all over my face when I walked into my childhood home in Palm Beach. My mother had taken one look at me and immediately launched into a lecture about my appearance. Sophia, you look so thin and tired. And your hair. Couldn't you have gotten it styled before coming home? The Weatherbees are having us over for dinner tomorrow, and I'd just prefer if you looked a little more presentable. Presentable. As if 3 months of 18-hour days coordinating humanitarian aid in an active war zone had been some sort of spa vacation that I'd simply handled poorly. I was 20 pounds underweight, running on maybe 4 hours of sleep per night for weeks, and carrying the names of people I hadn't been able to save. And she was worried about my hair? That dinner with the Weatherbees had been a masterclass in my family's ability to make me invisible while I was sitting right there at the table. The conversation had flown around me like water around a stone, touching on art gallery openings, real estate investments, and the latest drama in their social circle. When Mr. Weatherby had politely asked me what I did for work, my mother had jumped in before I could answer.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Oh, Sophia works in logistics," she'd said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Very boring, administrative stuff. Nothing as exciting as what Veronica's doing with her design firm." Logistics? 22 years of Marine Corps service reduced to boring administrative stuff? I'd sat there, in my civilian clothes, feeling like a fraud in my own skin, and realized that my mother wasn't just embarrassed by my career, she was ashamed of who I'd become. The daughter who had chosen duty over society, service over status, honor over appearances. The breaking point had come later that same visit, during what was supposed to be a quiet family lunch. Veronica had been showing off photos from her latest high-end residential project, a massive oceanfront mansion she'd designed for some tech billionaire. My parents were oohing and aahing over every detail, asking questions about furniture sourcing and color palettes with the intensity of art critics. I'd watched my sister glow under their attention and felt something twist inside my chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a deep,
aching loneliness that came from being perpetually on the outside of my own family's affection. When there was a lull in the conversation, I'd made the mistake of trying to contribute. "That's really impressive, Veronica," I'd said, and I'd meant it. "The scale reminds me of some of the construction projects we managed in Iraq. Obviously different purposes, but the logistics of coordinating that many contractors and materials in challenging conditions?" The temperature in the room had dropped 20 degrees. My mother had actually flinched as if I'd said something obscene. My father had cleared his throat and looked away. Even Veronica had given me a pained look that said, "Why do you always have to make everything about the military?" "Well," my mother had said with forced brightness, "let's talk about something more pleasant, shall we?" More pleasant? As if my entire life's work was an unpleasant topic that polite people didn't discuss. As if the 20 years I'd spent serving their country was something distasteful that needed to be swept under the rug along with other embarrassing family secrets. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom, with its pink walls and cheerleading trophies that belonged to the girl I'd been before I discovered who I was meant to become, I'd made a decision. I'd stopped trying to make them understand. Stopped hoping that someday they'd look at me with the same pride they reserve for Veronica's interior design projects or my mother's charity board positions. I'd accepted that in their world, I would always be the daughter who had taken a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in a place they couldn't follow. But this wedding invitation situation wasn't just another instance of their disapproval. This was active erasure. This was my own family telling me that I was too much of an embarrassment to be included in what should have been one of the most important days of our lives together. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Veronica's number. My finger hovered over the call button for a long moment before I pressed it. She answered on the third ring, and I could hear classical music and voices in the background. Probably another wedding planning session with Mom. "Sophia? Is everything okay? Natalie said she talked to you." "Veronica." I kept my voice level, professional, the same tone I used when briefing subordinates on critical missions. "I want to hear it from you directly. Am I invited to your wedding or not?" The pause stretched long enough that I could count my heartbeats. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and defensive. "Of course you're invited. You're my sister. It's complicated." Uncomplicated for me. Another pause, more classical music, a muffled conversation that I couldn't quite make out. "James's family is very traditional. His father is considering a Senate run next year, and the wedding is going to be covered by society photographers. There's going to be a lot of important people there, and we all think that it might be better if the focus stayed on the celebration instead of what, Veronica? Instead of questions about why a Marine is at a society wedding. People might think it's political or something." Political. My service to the country her future father-in-law wanted to represent in the Senate was political? The uniform I'd earned the right to wear through 2 decades of sacrifice and dedication was a political statement that might overshadow her special day? Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, and my voice had gone quiet in the way that made junior Marines nervous. "You're telling me that my presence at your wedding in the Marine dress uniform that I'm required by protocol to wear to formal events would be a distraction because your future in-laws might think I'm making some kind of political statement by existing?" "Sophia, please don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder than it has to be. I repeated the words slowly, tasting their bitter flavor. Veronica, do you have any idea what hard actually looks like? Do you know what I was doing 6 months ago while you were picking out centerpieces? I I I was in Somalia leading an evacuation convoy through hostile territory to get American civilians out of a collapsing city. I had 60 Marines under my command and 12 hours to get 400 people to safety before rebel forces overran our position. 3 of my Marines were wounded in that operation. One of them was 19 years old, barely older than you were when I left for my first deployment. Silence on the other end of the line. That's what hard looks like, Veronica. Your wedding planning difficulties don't even register on the scale of hard that I deal with every day. But you know what the hardest part of that mission was? It wasn't dodging sniper fire or coordinating air support or making life and death decisions under pressure. It was coming home and knowing that my own family would never understand or appreciate what I just sacrificed to keep them safe. Sophia, I'm sorry. You didn't what? Didn't think? Didn't consider that maybe the daughter who has spent her entire adult life serving her country might have feelings about being excluded from her sister's wedding? Didn't imagine asking me to hide who I am might be hurtful? When Veronica spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But Mom has been planning this wedding for months, and the guest list is already set, and James's family have very specific expectations.
And those expectations don't include me. They don't include complications. And you have to admit, Sophia, you are a complication. You always have been. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I had always been a complication in my family's carefully ordered world. The daughter who chose the Marines over college sororities, deployments over debutante balls, duty over comfort. The daughter who came home from war zones changed and haunted, and unable to pretend that their problems mattered on the same scale as life and death. You're right, I said quietly. I am a complication. I complicate your perfect narrative. I complicate your social standing. I complicate the story you want to tell about who you are and where you come from. That's not what I meant. Yes, it is. And you know what, Veronica? I'm tired of being sorry for it. I'm tired of apologizing for serving my country. I'm tired of making myself smaller so that you can feel bigger. I'm tired of pretending that what I do doesn't matter so that you can pretend what you do matters more. I took a breath and let 22 years of swallowed words finally surface. I have given everything to this country. I have missed birthdays and holidays and family gatherings because I was serving in places where people like James's father send people like me to do things they don't want to think about. I have earned every promotion, every commendation, every ribbon on my chest. I have led Marines into combat and brought them home alive. I have made decisions that saved lives and decisions that cost them. I have sacrificed my body and my peace of mind and my relationships for something bigger than myself. My voice was rising now, and I didn't care. And my own family wants me to hide all of that because it makes them uncomfortable? You want me to pretend I'm someone else, to dress like someone else, to be someone else, just so your future in-laws don't have to acknowledge that their privilege exists because people like me are willing to bleed for it? Sophia, I'm done, Veronica. I'm done pretending that your approval matters more than my integrity. I'm done making myself invisible so you can shine brighter. If my service to this country embarrasses you, if the uniform I've earned the right to wear is too much of a complication for your perfect wedding, then you're absolutely right. I shouldn't be there. I ended the call before she could respond and sat in the gathering darkness of my quarters, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't going to beg for my family's acceptance.
I wasn't going to twist myself into shapes that fit their expectations. I wasn't going to apologize for being exactly who I was meant to be. The next morning brought an email that changed everything, though I wouldn't understand its significance until much later. It was from the Marine Corps Liaison Office at the Pentagon, a formal notification that I'd been selected to represent the Corps at a high-profile civilian event in Miami Beach. The event was a charity gala for military families, hosted by some prominent political figure I'd never heard of. Black tie affair, full dress blues required, transportation and accommodations provided. The date was Saturday, November 18th, Veronica's wedding day. I stared at the email for a long time, reading the details over and over. The host's name was familiar somehow, though I couldn't place where I'd heard it before. James Ashford Sr., former governor of Florida, current political powerhouse, and patriarch of one of the state's most influential families. James Ashford Sr., as in James Ashford III's father, as in my sister's future father-in-law. The man who was hosting a military charity gala on the same day his son was getting married to my sister. The man whose family had deemed my military service too political, too complicated, too embarrassing for their society wedding. The same man who was apparently honored to host an event celebrating military families and their service to the country. I read the email 3 more times, letting the irony settle into my bones like a fine wine. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor. I picked up my phone and dialed the Pentagon liaison office. A crisp, professional voice answered on the second ring. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison speaking. Ma'am, this is Colonel Sophia Castellano. I received an email about representing the Corps at the Ashford Charity Gala in Miami Beach. Ah, yes, Colonel Castellano. Congratulations on the selection. It's quite an honor. Governor Ashford specifically requested senior female officers who had served in combat roles. Your record in Syria and Somalia was particularly impressive to the selection committee. My record? The same record that my family wanted me to hide, the same service they considered too complicated for polite society, had impressed a selection committee enough to choose me as a representative of the Marine Corps at a high-profile event. Ma'am, I need to confirm the date and location of this event. Saturday, November 18th at the Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach. Cocktail reception at 6, dinner at 7:30, followed by remarks from Governor Ashford and the Medal of Honor recipient who's being honored that evening. You'll be seated at the head table with the other service representatives and distinguished guests. The Breakers Hotel. The same venue where Veronica was getting married. The same date, the same time, the same zip code where my family was celebrating their triumph while systematically erasing me from their story. Colonel, are you still there? Yes, ma'am. I accept the assignment. Excellent. You'll receive detailed protocols and transportation arrangements within the week. This is a significant event, Colonel. The guest list includes senators, congressmen, business leaders, and major donors to military charities. Your presence will represent not just the Marine Corps, but all servicewomen who've served in combat roles. After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation. Not the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but the calm certainty that sometimes the universe provides its own justice. I wouldn't have to choose between my integrity and my family's approval. The choice had been made for me by someone who understood the value of what I had sacrificed, what I had accomplished, what I represented. I was going to be in Palm Beach on November 18th after all, not as the embarrassing sister who needed to be hidden away, but as an honored representative of the United States Marine Corps. Not in a civilian dress that denied who I was, but in my dress blues with every ribbon and star I'd earned. Not begging for acceptance from people who were ashamed of my service, but celebrated by people who understood its value. For the first time since Natalie's phone call, I smiled. The weeks that followed brought a flurry of activity that had nothing to do with wedding preparations I wasn't invited to participate in, and everything to do with preparing for an event where I was not just welcome, but specifically requested. I received detailed briefings on the other attendees, protocol instructions for interacting with civilian dignitaries, and a comprehensive background on the charity the event was supporting. The Ashford Foundation for Military Families provided housing assistance, educational scholarships, and counseling services to service members and their dependents. It was legitimate, well-funded, and highly regarded within the military community. Governor Ashford had started it after his youngest brother was killed in Afghanistan in 2008, and it had grown into one of the most effective military charities in the country. I found myself genuinely impressed by the scope of their work and grateful to be part of an event that would raise significant funds for families who needed support. This wasn't some empty social occasion designed to showcase wealth and connections. It was a serious fundraising effort for a cause that mattered, hosted by people who understood the real cost of military service. The irony was still delicious, but the more I learned about the event, the more I realized it was exactly where I belonged.
Not because it would spite my family, but because it would honor the community I'd actually chosen, the people who'd actually shaped who I'd become. 3 days before the event, I received an unexpected phone call from my mother. Her voice was tight with barely controlled emotion when I answered. "Sophia, I need to talk to you about something. If this is about the wedding, Mom, we've already covered that ground. I won't be attending." "That's just it! I heard from Mrs. Pemberton that you're going to be at some military thing at the Breakers that same night. She saw your name on some list." Mrs. Pemberton? President of the Palm Beach Preservation Society and one of my mother's closest friends. Also, apparently a supporter of military charities who had purchased a table at Governor Ashford's gala? "I'm representing the Marine Corps at a charity event, yes?" "Sophia, you cannot do this! You cannot show up at the same hotel on the same night as your sister's wedding in your military uniform. It will look like you're trying to upstage her." The accusation was so absurd that I actually laughed. "Mom, I'm not trying to upstage anyone. I'm attending a completely separate event that I was specifically invited to by the Pentagon. The fact that it's at the same location is a coincidence." "It's not a coincidence. It's a disaster." "What are people going to think? What are James's parents going to think?" "Maybe they'll think that military service is something to be honored instead of hidden away." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. When my mother spoke again, her voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. "You have always been selfish, Sophia. Always. From the day you enlisted against our wishes to this moment right now, you have consistently chosen yourself over this family. Your sister's wedding is the most important day of her life, and you're determined to ruin it." "I'm determined to do my job, Mom. The same job I've been doing for 22 years while you pretended it didn't exist." "Your job," she said with contempt. "Your precious job that you've used as an excuse to miss family gatherings, to avoid responsibility, to play dress-up soldier while the rest of us live in the real world." The words hit me like a slap across the face. Play dress-up soldier? 22 years of service? 4 combat deployments? Countless lives saved and lost reduced to playing dress-up soldier? You know what, Mom? You're absolutely right. I have consistently chosen something over this family. I've chosen honor over hypocrisy. I've chosen service over selfishness. I've chosen integrity over image. And I'd make the same choice again every single day for the rest of my life. Then don't expect to be welcome in this family anymore. The line went dead. I stared at my phone for a long moment, then set it carefully on my desk. 22 years of trying to earn their approval, and it had come to this. An ultimatum delivered by a woman who had never understood the first thing about who I was or what I valued. I felt lighter, as if a weight I'd been carrying for decades had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time since I'd enlisted, I was free from the exhausting burden of trying to make them proud of something they were determined to be ashamed of. The morning of November 18th dawned clear and warm, typical Florida weather that made my dress blues feel formal and crisp against my skin.
I had spent an hour that morning going through my pre-event ritual, polishing every button and buckle until they gleamed, checking the alignment of every ribbon and medal, ensuring that every detail of my appearance met the exacting standards the Corps demanded. Looking at myself in the mirror, I saw not the disappointment my family perceived, but the Marine I'd worked 2 decades to become. The ribbon on my chest told the story of my service. Purple Heart from Afghanistan, Bronze Star with V device from Iraq, Combat Action Ribbon, Meritorious Service Medal with Gold Star, and a dozen others that marked deployments, campaigns, and recognition for excellence in a career that had taken me around the world in service to my country. This was who I was. This was who I'd chosen to become. And for the first time in my adult life, I was going to spend an evening with people who understood and appreciated that choice. The drive to Palm Beach took me along familiar roads lined with palm trees and expensive cars, past the country clubs and gated communities where I'd grown up, and through the carefully manicured world that my family inhabited and I'd left behind. As I pulled into the circular drive of the Breakers Hotel, I could see the preparations for both events taking place simultaneously. On the ocean side of the hotel, Veronica's wedding was being set up in the oceanfront pavilion. White chairs arranged in perfect rows, an archway of flowers that probably cost more than most people made in a month, photographers positioning equipment to capture every moment of social triumph. On the other side of the hotel, in the main ballroom, the military charity gala was being prepared with equal attention to detail, but different priorities. American flags flanked the stage where Governor Ashford would speak. Tables were adorned with centerpieces that incorporated military insignia and photos of service members. And a silent option displayed items donated by supporters of the foundation. 2 events, same location, completely different worlds. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly which world I belonged in. I checked in with the event coordinator, a crisp young woman in a navy blue suit, who greeted me with the respect and professionalism I was accustomed to in military settings. She reviewed my role for the evening, introduced me to the other service representatives, and briefed me on the protocol for the various dignitaries who would be in attendance. As I walked through the ballroom, reviewing seating arrangements and familiarizing myself with the evening's agenda, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to find a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes extending his hand. "Colonel Castellano, I'm James Ashford Sr. Thank you so much for being here tonight." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. "Governor Ashford, it's an honor to represent the Marine Corps at your event." "The honor is entirely mine, Colonel. I've read your service record, and I have to tell you, it's extraordinary. Your work evacuating civilians in Syria and your logistics command in Somalia have saved countless lives. The Marine Corps is fortunate to have officers of your caliber." His words were genuine, informed, and delivered with the kind of respect that my own family had never shown for my service. Standing there in my dress blues, being acknowledged by a man who understood the significance of what those ribbons represented, I felt a profound sense of vindication. "Thank you, sir. I'm grateful for the Foundation's work supporting military families. It makes a real difference in the lives of people who've sacrificed for their country. It's the least we can do. And speaking of sacrifice, I understand you're originally from this area." "Yes, sir. Born and raised in Palm Beach." "Well, then you'll appreciate the local connections here tonight. This community has always been supportive of military families, and we're honored to have one of our own who served with such distinction representing the Corps." One of our own. The phrase lingered in my mind as Governor Ashford moved on to greet other guests. He saw me as one of their own, a representative of their community who had served with honor. My own family saw me as an embarrassment who needed to be hidden away. As the cocktail reception began, I found myself in conversations with senators, business leaders, and philanthropists who were genuinely interested in my experiences and genuinely grateful for my service.
They asked thoughtful questions about military life,
listened respectfully to my responses, and treated my career as something worth celebrating rather than something to be ashamed of. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by people who understood the value of service and sacrifice, I realized that I had spent 2 decades seeking approval from the wrong audience. These people, strangers who had never met me before tonight, showed me more respect and appreciation in one evening than my own family had shown me in 22 years. At 7:15, as I was finishing a conversation with a congressman about military logistics challenges, the event coordinator appeared at my elbow. "Colonel, we're about to begin seating for dinner. You're at table 1, directly in front of the podium." Table 1. The head table. The place of honor reserved for distinguished guests and event honorees. I followed her across the ballroom, past tables full of Palm Beach's elite, military supporters, and political figures, to a table directly below the stage where Governor Ashford would speak. My place card was elegant, formal. Colonel Sophia Castellano, United States Marine Corps. Not Sophia, who works for the government, or the daughter who chose the military. Colonel Sophia Castellano, with my rank and service prominently displayed for everyone to see. As I took my seat, I had a clear view of the ballroom's entrance and could see guests still arriving for the cocktail reception. The ballroom was filling with the kind of people my mother had always desperately wanted to impress, the same social elite that would be attending Veronica's wedding reception in just a few hours. And then I saw them. My parents walked into the ballroom, dressed in formal evening wear, looking exactly as polished and sophisticated as they always did at these kinds of events. They were followed by Veronica and James III, still in their wedding attire, glowing with the happiness of newlyweds and the satisfaction of a social triumph successfully executed. My heart stopped. They were here, at the military charity gala. At the event, they had insisted I not attend because my military service would be too political, too complicated, too embarrassing for their social standing. I watched them approach the check-in table, where they were greeted warmly by the same event coordinator who had briefed me earlier. They were clearly expected guests, not last-minute additions. Their names were on the list, their table assignment was ready, their presence was planned and welcomed. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't excluded me from Veronica's wedding because of scheduling conflicts or space limitations. They had excluded me because they were ashamed of who I was. And then they had turned around and attended the very military charity event they had used as an excuse to erase me from their family celebration. I sat frozen at table 1, watching my family be welcomed into the very world they had insisted I didn't belong in, treated with the very respect they had told me I would never receive. The hypocrisy was so breathtaking, so complete that I couldn't even process the full scope of it. And then Governor Ashford stepped to the podium to begin his remarks, and everything changed forever. Governor Ashford's voice carried across the ballroom with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. He spoke eloquently about the sacrifice of military families, about a debt of gratitude owed to those who served, about the importance of supporting the men and women who defended our freedom. Every word was a direct contradiction to the message my family had delivered just hours earlier. As he spoke, I watched my parents and sister listening with rapt attention, nodding along with sentiments they had actively rejected when they came from their own daughter. They applauded when he mentioned the courage of service members. They smiled when he talked about honoring military families. They looked appropriately moved when he described the challenges faced by those who chose duty over comfort. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. These were the same people who had told me my service was political, embarrassing, inappropriate for polite society, yet here they sat, in their formal evening wear, publicly celebrating the very values they had privately rejected when I embodied them. Tonight, Governor Ashford continued, we honor not just the abstract concept of service, but the real people who have answered the call to serve our nation in its most challenging hours. We recognize that freedom is not free, and that the price of our liberty is paid daily by men and women who choose something greater than themselves. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Not from sadness, but from the profound relief of finally hearing someone articulate what I had spent 2 decades trying to make my family understand. This was what service meant. This was why it mattered. This was why the uniform I wore represented something worth celebrating, not hiding. Our featured honoree tonight exemplifies the finest traditions of military service, the governor said, and I prepared to applaud whichever Medal of Honor recipient was being recognized. Colonel Sophia Castellano of the United States Marine Corps has served our nation with distinction for 22 years, including 4 combat deployments and leadership roles in some of our most critical overseas operations. The room seemed to tilt sideways. My name. He had said my name. I was the featured honoree. I was the reason this event existed tonight. Colonel Castellano? Colonel Castellano's recent work coordinating humanitarian evacuations in Syria and Somalia has saved hundreds of civilian lives while protecting American interests in volatile regions. Her leadership, courage, and unwavering commitment to both her Marines and her mission exemplify the finest traditions of military service. The applause began slowly, then built to a thunderous crescendo as 1,000 people rose to their feet. I sat frozen in my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just recognition of my service. This was vindication of everything I had chosen, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had become. Colonel Castellano, would you please join me on stage? I stood on unsteady legs, my vision blurred by tears I no longer tried to hide. As I walked toward the stage, the applause continued, wave after wave of appreciation from people who understood the value of what I had given to serve my country. Each step felt surreal, as if I were walking through a dream where everything I had ever hoped for was finally coming true. But as I passed table 12, where my family sat in stunned silence, I saw their faces clearly for the first time. My father's mouth hung open in shock, his usual composure completely shattered. My mother's hand was pressed to her chest, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. Veronica sat frozen in her wedding dress, her face pale with the dawning realization of what she had done. And James III, my new brother-in-law, was staring at me with a mixture of awe and horror, finally understanding that the embarrassing military sister they had erased from their wedding celebration was the same decorated Marine his father was honoring as a hero. I reached the stage and shook Governor Ashford's hand, the cameras flashing around us like small explosions of light. He leaned in close as we posed for photos, his voice low enough that only I could hear. Colonel, I have to ask, are you by any chance related to the Castellanos from Palm Beach, Vincent and Patricia? Yes, sir. They're my parents. His eyebrows rose slightly. Interesting. They're sitting at one of our premium tables tonight. I had no idea they had a daughter serving in the Marine Corps, let alone one being honored at our event. The understatement was almost laughable. They had no idea because they had spent 22 years pretending I didn't exist in any meaningful way. They were here tonight supporting military families in the abstract while simultaneously rejecting the military family member who shared their name and their blood. Family dynamics can be complicated, sir. Indeed they can. He smiled, but there was something sharp in his eyes. Well, they must be incredibly proud of you tonight. If only he knew. If only any of these people knew that the parents of the woman they were honoring had spent the day erasing her from their family celebration because her service was too embarrassing to acknowledge. Governor Ashford presented me with a crystal plaque recognizing my service and contributions to national security. As I accepted it, I thought about another award. Another moment of recognition that had been met with polite indifference and quickly forgotten. The difference wasn't in the awards themselves, but in the audience receiving them. Here, surrounded by people who understood the value of service, my accomplishments mattered. Here, my sacrifice was seen as something worthy of celebration rather than something to be hidden away. Here, I was finally being recognized not despite who I was, but because of who I was. The governor invited me to say a few words, and I approached the microphone with 22 years of suppressed emotion building in my chest. Looking out over the crowd, I could see my family's table, could see their faces frozen in shock and something that might have been shame. Thank you, Governor Ashford, for this incredible honor. When I enlisted in the Marine Corps 22 years ago, I thought I understood what service meant. I thought it was about defending our country, protecting our interests, and supporting our allies around the world. What I learned over 2 decades of service is that defending our country sometimes means defending it from people who don't understand its values. Sometimes the greatest threats to our freedom come not from foreign enemies, but from those who diminish the very sacrifices that preserve their liberty. A murmur ran through the crowd.
This wasn't the typical acceptance speech they were expecting. I have served in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Somalia. I have made decisions that cost lives and decisions that saved them. I have led Marines through hostile territory and brought them home safely. I have sacrificed relationships, comfort, and security in service to ideals that I believed were shared by all Americans. I could see my mother's face now, pale with the dawning realization of where this speech was heading. But the greatest challenge I have faced as a Marine hasn't been enemy fire or impossible missions or the weight of command responsibility. The greatest challenge has been trying to earn the respect of people who should have understood my service, but chose instead to be ashamed of it. The silence in the ballroom was complete now, 1,000 people hanging on every word. Tonight, surrounded by Americans who understand the value of service and sacrifice, I am reminded that respect cannot be demanded or begged for. It must be earned, and it must be given by people worthy of giving it. I looked directly at my family's table, meeting each of their eyes in turn. To every service member in this room, and to every military family represented here tonight, I want you to know that your service matters. Your sacrifice has meaning. Your commitment to something greater than yourself is worthy of celebration, not shame. The applause began again, but I wasn't finished. And to those who have forgotten the cost of the freedom they enjoy, who take for granted the security purchased with other people's blood, who measure worth only in dollars and social status, I say this: we serve not because you appreciate us, but because service itself is honorable. We wear the uniform not for your approval, but because some things are worth more than approval. The standing ovation that followed was deafening, but I barely heard it. I was looking at my family, watching 22 years of judgment and dismissal crumble under the weight of public recognition. They sat like statues while everyone around them cheered for the daughter, the sister, they had been ashamed to acknowledge. As I returned to my seat, shaking hands with well-wishers and accepting congratulations from strangers who understood my service better than my own family, I felt a profound shift in my understanding of myself. For 2 decades, I had defined my worth partly by their opinion of me. I had carried their disappointment like a stone in my chest, always hoping that someday I would achieve something significant enough to change their minds. Tonight, I realized that their minds were never going to change, not because I hadn't achieved enough, but because they were incapable of recognizing achievement that didn't fit their narrow definition of success. They could applaud military service in the abstract, donate money to military charities, and attend events honoring veterans, but they couldn't celebrate it when it came from their own daughter. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations with people who wanted to thank me for my service, share their own military connections, or simply express their appreciation for the sacrifices made by service members and their families. Senators asked for my insights on military policy, business leaders inquired about veteran employment programs, and fellow service members shared their own stories of challenges and triumphs. I was surrounded by community, by people who saw me as I actually was, rather than as a disappointment compared to who they thought I should be. The contrast with my family's rejection was stark and painful,
but also liberating. I no longer needed their validation because I had found it from people whose opinions actually mattered. Around 10 o'clock, as the formal program wound down and guests began to mingle more freely, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to find James III standing behind me, his face pale and his wedding tuxedo slightly rumpled. "Sophia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" I followed him to a quiet corner of the ballroom, near the windows overlooking the ocean where his wedding reception had been held just hours earlier. The contrast was impossible to ignore. He had spent his wedding day celebrating the beginning of his new life, while simultaneously participating in the exclusion of the woman his father was honoring as a hero. He had no idea. He said finally, "I swear to you, Sophia, I had no idea who you were, what you had done, what you had achieved. If I had known, you would have what, James? Overruled your wife and her parents? Insisted that the embarrassing military sister be included in your perfect wedding?" He flinched at the harshness in my voice, but I was beyond caring about his comfort. "Your father just spent an hour talking about the importance of honoring military service, about the debt owed to those who sacrifice for their country. And your new wife spent today making sure that the military service member in her own family was erased from the most important day of her life because it might embarrass her. She didn't know either. None of us knew how important your work was, how much you had accomplished. James, my work hasn't changed. My accomplishments haven't magically become more impressive since this morning. The only thing that changed is that your father told them they were worth celebrating. For 22 years, I have been serving this country with distinction. For 22 years, my family has been treating that service as something to be ashamed of." I gestured toward the ballroom, where people were still discussing the evening's program and my recognition. "Every person in this room knows more about the value of military service than my own family does. Strangers have shown me more respect tonight than I have received from the people who share my blood in 2 decades. What can we do? How can we make this right?" The question was so naive, so inadequate to the scope of what had been done, that I almost laughed. "You can't make this right, James. You can't undo the fact that you excluded me from your wedding because you were ashamed of who I am. You can't undo 22 years of your wife and her parents treating my service as an embarrassment rather than an honor. But we can try. We can acknowledge what we did wrong. You can what, James? Apologize for being exactly who you are? Promise to respect something you fundamentally don't understand? Pretend to value sacrifices you've never been willing to make?" He stood there in his expensive tuxedo, a product of privilege and entitlement, trying to comprehend the weight of service and sacrifice, and I realized he was as incapable of understanding my world as my family was. "James, you married into a family that measures worth by social status and bank accounts. You come from a family that understands the importance of military service in the abstract, but has never had to live with its realities. The gap between those worlds isn't something you can bridge with good intentions and belated recognition. So that's it? You're just going to cut us all off? I'm going to stop expecting you to be people you're not capable of being. I'm going to stop hoping for respect from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. I'm going to stop trying to earn love from people who see my greatest accomplishments as character flaws." Before he could respond, I saw my parents approaching across the ballroom. My mother's face was streaked with tears that had destroyed her carefully applied makeup, and my father looked older than I had ever seen him. Behind them, Veronica walked slowly, her wedding dress trailing on the marble floor, her expression lost and confused. They stopped a few feet away, as if approaching too close might result in physical harm. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 22 years of accumulated damage. "Sophia," my mother finally said, her voice broken and raw, "we didn't know. We had no idea that your work was so important." Significant? Worthy of recognition? Mom, my work hasn't changed since this morning when you were telling me it was too embarrassing to acknowledge at Veronica's wedding. But Governor Ashford said you saved hundreds of lives, that you were leading critical missions.
I've been leading critical missions for 2 decades. I've been saving lives for 2 decades. I've been serving with distinction for 2 decades. The only thing that's different tonight is that someone you consider important finally told you it mattered. My father stepped forward, his hands clasped in front of him like a supplicant. Sophia, we made a mistake. We didn't understand. You didn't understand because you didn't want to understand. You didn't care to learn about my work because it didn't fit the narrative you wanted to tell about your family. You preferred to have 2 successful daughters, rather than 2 successful daughters and one who served. That's not true, Veronica said, speaking for the first time. We always knew you were successful. We just thought... You thought what, Veronica? That my success didn't matter as much as yours? That service to country was less impressive than interior design? That leading Marines in combat was less significant than decorating houses for rich people? She flinched as if I'd struck her, but I was beyond caring about their feelings. You excluded me from your wedding because you were embarrassed by who I am. You asked me to hide the uniform I earned the right to wear because it might make your husband's family uncomfortable. And then you showed up at an event celebrating military service, applauding the very values you rejected when they came from your own sister. We didn't know it was the same thing, my mother said desperately. We didn't know you would be here, that you were the one being honored. And that makes it better? That you accidentally attended an event celebrating your daughter while simultaneously excluding her from your family celebration? That you happened to applaud military service while being ashamed of the military service member in your own family? The people around us had begun to notice our conversation, though they were too polite to openly stare. Governor Ashford caught my eye from across the room and raised his eyebrows in question. I shook my head slightly, indicating that I could handle the situation. What do you want from us, Sophia? My father asked. What can we do to fix this? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with 22 years of pain and disappointment. What did I want from them? For so long, I had wanted their approval, their pride, their recognition of who I had become. I had wanted them to see my service as valuable, my sacrifices as meaningful, my choices as worthy of respect. But standing there in my dress blues, surrounded by the residual warmth of genuine appreciation from people who understood the cost of service, I realized that what I wanted from them was no longer something they could give. I want you to stop pretending that you understand what service means when you've spent 2 decades proving that you don't. I want you to stop claiming to support military families while rejecting the military family member who shares your name. I want you to stop trying to have it both ways, celebrating service in public while being ashamed of it in private. We're not ashamed of you, Veronica said, tears streaming down her face. Yes, you are. You've been ashamed of me since the day I enlisted, ashamed that I chose something that didn't fit your social aspirations, ashamed that I valued duty over comfort, service over status, honor over appearances. You've spent 22 years trying to make me smaller so you could feel bigger, trying to diminish my choices so you could justify your own. That's not fair, my mother protested. Fair? The word came out sharper than I intended. Mom, what exactly has been fair about the way you've treated my career? What's fair about celebrating Leo's business success while dismissing my military service? What's fair about asking me to hide who I am so your friends don't have to feel uncomfortable? What's fair about excluding me from family celebrations because my uniform might make people ask questions you don't want to answer? She had no response to that because there was no response. The unfairness had been systematic, consistent, and deliberate. I'm done, I said quietly. I'm done trying to earn respect from people who are incapable of giving it. I'm done hoping for recognition from people who see my greatest achievements as embarrassments.
I'm done begging for acceptance from people who should have celebrated me from the beginning. Sophia, please, Veronica said, reaching toward me. We can do better. We can learn. You can what? Suddenly develop the capacity for respect you've lacked for 22 years? Magically understand the value of sacrifice after 2 decades of dismissing it? Transform overnight into the family you should have been all along? I looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces not with love, but with finality. I have spent my entire adult life trying to bridge the gap between your world and mine. I have made excuses for your behavior, rationalized your dismissal, and blamed myself for your inability to appreciate what I chose to become. Tonight, I realized that the problem was never with me or my choices. The problem was with people who could only value what they were told to value by others. Governor Ashford approached our group, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with understanding. Colonel Castellano, I hope everything is all right here. Everything is fine, Governor. My family was just leaving. He glanced at my parents, then at Veronica in her wedding dress, and I could see him putting pieces together. Of course. Colonel, I wanted to let you know that several of our guests have expressed interest in hearing more about your work with military logistics. Senator Morrison particularly wanted to discuss veteran employment programs if you have time. It was both a genuine offer and a graceful exit from an uncomfortable situation. I appreciated both aspects. I'd be honored to speak with the senator. Excellent. Perhaps we could continue this conversation over coffee tomorrow morning. I know several key donors who would benefit from your insights on supporting military families. The invitation was clearly extended in front of my family, intentionally. Here was one of Florida's most prominent political figures asking for my professional input, seeking my expertise, valuing my perspective. The contrast with their dismissal couldn't have been more stark. I'd be delighted, Governor. He nodded approvingly, then turned to my family with polite but distant courtesy. Mr. and Mrs. Castellano, Mrs. Ashford, thank you for supporting our military families tonight. I hope you found the evening enlightening. There was steel beneath the politeness, a subtle indication that he understood exactly what kind of people they were and exactly how they had treated the daughter, the sister, he was honoring. After he walked away, my family stood in uncomfortable silence, finally beginning to grasp the full scope of what they had lost. Not just me, but the respect and connections that came with recognizing and supporting my achievements. Governor Ashford's polite dismissal had been a master class in social consequences, showing them exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of people that mattered. Sophia, my father tried one more time, please, don't let it end like this.
I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had raised me but never really known me, who had provided for me but never truly supported me, who had loved me in his limited way but never respected me. Dad, it ended like this the day you decided my service was less important than Veronica's interior design career. It ended like this the day you told me to hide my uniform because it made you uncomfortable. It ended like this the day you chose image over integrity, status over sacrifice, appearance over honor. I turned to go, then paused and looked back at them one final time. For what it's worth, I hope someday you understand what you gave up. I hope someday you realize that the daughter you were ashamed of was actually the one you should have been proudest of. But I won't be waiting for that realization anymore. As I walked away from them, back toward the people who had celebrated my service and valued my sacrifice, I felt the last chains of their disapproval finally breaking. For 22 years, I had carried the weight of their judgment, the burden of their expectations, the pain of their rejection. Tonight, surrounded by genuine appreciation and authentic respect, I was finally free. Behind me, I could hear my mother's quiet sobs, my father's whispered attempts at comfort, Veronica's broken apologies to the empty air. But their pain was no longer my responsibility. Their regret was no longer my burden. Their realization of what they had lost was no longer my concern. I was Colonel Sophia Castellano, United States Marine Corps. I had served my country with honor for 22 years. I had saved lives, led Marines, and protected American interests around the world.
And for the first time in my adult life, I was surrounded by people who understood that those things mattered more than social status, more than wealth, more than the approval of people too small to appreciate greatness when they saw it. The evening was far from over, but my relationship with my family was finally, mercifully complete. The weeks that followed felt like emerging from a long, suffocating tunnel into clear daylight. For the first time in decades, my phone wasn't buzzing with guilt-inducing messages from family members, wasn't ringing with passive-aggressive calls designed to make me feel small. The silence was profound, peaceful, and absolutely liberating. My conversation with Governor Ashford had indeed continued over coffee the next morning, extending into a 3-hour discussion about veteran employment programs, military family support initiatives, and the challenges facing transitioning service members. What had begun as a courtesy meeting evolved into a genuine collaboration, with the governor asking me to join the advisory board for his foundation. 2 weeks later, I received a formal offer to become the executive director of military affairs for the Ashford Foundation, a position that would allow me to continue serving military families while transitioning toward eventual retirement from active duty. The salary was generous, the mission was meaningful, and the respect was automatic and unwavering. I accepted without hesitation. The irony wasn't lost on me that James Ashford Sr., the man whose son had married into my family, had become a more supportive father figure in 1 month than my actual father had been in 44 years. He understood the value of my experience, appreciated my insights, and treated my military background as an asset rather than an embarrassment. During one of our planning meetings, as we discussed expanding the Foundation Scholarship Program for military children, he brought up the elephant in the room with characteristic directness. "Sophia, I hope you don't mind me asking, but after the charity gala, I couldn't help but notice some tension between you and your family. I assume that's been resolved?" I set down my coffee cup and met his gaze steadily. "Governor, with all due respect, there's nothing to resolve. My family made their priorities clear, and I've made mine equally clear in response." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are the ones closest to home." "Yes, sir. But sometimes those are also the most necessary ones." "Indeed. Well, for what it's worth, their loss is our gain. The Foundation is fortunate to have someone of your caliber leading our military programs." That conversation marked the beginning of what felt like a new chapter in my life, one where my professional worth wasn't questioned, my personal choices weren't criticized, and my service record was seen as qualification rather than complication. I threw myself into the work with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years, developing programs that made real differences in the lives of military families who understood struggle and sacrifice. The Foundation's offices were located in a sleek downtown Miami building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Biscayne Bay. My corner office came with a view of the water, and more importantly, with staff members who respected my military background and valued my combat experience. They asked intelligent questions about my deployments, sought my advice on program development, and treated my insights as valuable contributions rather than awkward interruptions. 3 months into my new position, I was reviewing applications for emergency housing assistance when my assistant knocked on my office door. "Colonel, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you. She says she's your sister." I looked up from the stack of files, my stomach tightening reflexively. Through the glass wall of my office, I could see Veronica sitting in the reception area, still perfectly put together but somehow diminished, as if the confidence that had always defined her had been drained away. "Tell her I'm unavailable for personal visits during business hours." My assistant, a former Army sergeant named Marcus, who had joined the Foundation after completing his master's degree in social work, raised an eyebrow. "She says it's urgent." "Marcus, everything is urgent to people who aren't accustomed to being told no. If she'd like to schedule an appointment to discuss Foundation business, she can do so through proper channels. Otherwise, my personal time is my own." He grinned and headed back to reception. Through the glass, I watched him deliver the message with military precision. Veronica's face crumpled slightly, but she stood and walked toward the elevator without creating a scene. Good. She had learned something about boundaries, even if it had taken 41 years. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Veronica's name appeared on the caller ID and I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. By the fourth call, I turned off the ringer and focused on my work reviewing grant applications for military spouses pursuing advanced degrees. The voicemail she left was 7 minutes long, a rambling combination of apology, explanation, and justification that perfectly encapsulated everything that was wrong with my family's approach to relationships. She was sorry I was upset, sorry there had been a misunderstanding, sorry that things had gotten so complicated. She never once acknowledged that they had been wrong, that their behavior had been hurtful, and that their treatment of me had been fundamentally unjust. I deleted the message without finishing it. That evening, as I was leaving the office, I found her waiting by my car in the parking garage. She was wearing a simple black dress and minimal makeup, looking more vulnerable than I had ever seen her before. For just a moment, I felt a flicker of the old dynamic, the protective instinct toward my little sister that had defined our relationship when we were children. Then I remembered her wedding day, remembered the casual cruelty of being erased from the most important event in her life, and the moment of softness hardened back into steel. "Hello, Veronica." "Sophia, please, I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but I need to talk to you." "You needed to talk to me 3 months ago, before you decided I was too embarrassing to include in your wedding. You needed to talk to me 22 years ago, before you decided my career was something to be ashamed of. You needed to talk to me during any of the thousands of opportunities you've had over the past 2 decades to show basic respect for my choices." She took a step closer, and I could see tears building in her eyes. I know, I messed up. We all messed up. But Sophia, we're family." "Are we?" "Because family members don't usually exclude each other from weddings because they're embarrassed by their careers. Family members don't usually ask each other to hide who they are to make social situations more comfortable. Family members don't usually treat each other's life choices as character flaws that need to be managed. I was wrong. We all were wrong. But please, can't we try to fix this?" I clicked the remote to unlock my car, a practical Honda Accord that was perfectly suited to my needs and completely unimpressive by my family standards. The contrast with her BMW convertible parked 2 spaces away seemed to summarize our fundamental differences. "Veronica, what exactly do you think needs to be fixed? My career? My choices? My uniform? My values?"
Because those are the things you've spent 22 years treating as problems that needed solutions. No, that's not what I mean. I want to fix our relationship. I want to fix our family. Our family isn't broken, Veronica. It's working exactly as designed. You and Mom and Dad have created a perfect little ecosystem where image matters more than substance, where social status trumps personal integrity, where success is measured by applause from the right people rather than actual achievement. I opened my car door but didn't get in, not quite ready to end this conversation despite its predictable trajectory. The system isn't broken. I'm just finally admitting that I don't belong in it, and I'm no longer interested in trying to change myself to fit. But we can change. We can do better. We can learn to appreciate what you've accomplished. The words were earnest, sincere, and completely missing the point. Veronica, you shouldn't have to learn to appreciate military service. You shouldn't have to be taught that serving your country is honorable. You shouldn't require lessons in respecting sacrifice and dedication. Those are basic human decencies that should have been obvious from the beginning. You're right. You're absolutely right. But you can still what? Pretend to value things you fundamentally don't understand? Force yourselves to show respect you don't actually feel? Go through the motions of appreciation while secretly wishing I had made different choices. She was crying openly now, but I felt no urge to comfort her. Her tears were for the loss of something she had never actually valued, grief for a relationship she had never actually nurtured. I don't want to lose you, Sophia. You lost me a long time ago, Sophia. You just didn't notice because you were too busy being embarrassed by who I was to pay attention to who I was becoming.
What about Christmas? What about family gatherings? What about when mom and dad get older and need help? Are you just going to abandon us completely? The questions revealed the transactional nature of how she viewed family relationships. I was useful during holidays for filling out photos and providing the illusion of family unity. I was valuable as a backup plan for elderly parent care. I was needed as a supporting character in their family narrative, but only as long as I stayed quiet about the leading role in my own story. I'm not abandoning anyone, Veronica. I'm simply refusing to participate in relationships that require me to diminish myself for other people's comfort. If you want to have a relationship with me, it's going to be based on mutual respect and genuine appreciation for who I actually am, not who you wish I was. But that's what I'm trying to tell you. I do respect who you are. I do appreciate what you've accomplished. Since when? Since Governor Ashford told you to? Since you realized that other important people valued my service? Since it became socially acceptable in your circles to acknowledge military achievement? She had no answer for that, because we both knew the truth. Her newfound respect wasn't genuine appreciation developed over time. It was borrowed validation, secondhand recognition that she felt obligated to echo because more powerful people had expressed it first. Veronica, I'm going to say this once, clearly, so there's no misunderstanding. I am not interested in rebuilding a relationship based on your belated recognition of my worth. I am not interested in pretending that 22 years of dismissal can be erased by a few months of guilty conscience. I am not interested in being the military daughter you trot out when it's convenient and hide away when it's not. I got into my car and started the engine, rolling down the window for one final exchange. I wish you well, Veronica. I hope you have a happy marriage, a successful career, and a fulfilling life. But I'm going to have those things too, surrounded by people who valued me from the beginning, rather than people who only learned to appreciate me when someone else told them they should. As I drove away, leaving her standing alone in the parking garage, I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, no sense of victory, just a profound sadness for what could have been if they had possessed the capacity to see beyond their own limited worldview from the start. The months that followed brought professional recognition and personal fulfillment in equal measure. The Foundation's military programs expanded dramatically under my leadership, earning national attention and significant increases in donor support. I was invited to speak at conferences, testify before congressional committees, and advise other organizations on veteran support initiatives. More importantly, I was surrounded by colleagues who understood the veteran community because they belonged to it. My deputy director was a former Air Force logistics officer who had transitioned to nonprofit work after retiring as a lieutenant colonel. My program coordinators included former enlisted personnel from all branches of service who brought diverse perspectives and genuine empathy to their work with military families. We spoke the same language, shared similar values, and understood the unique challenges facing those who had chosen service over comfort. For the first time in my adult life, I was part of a professional community where my background was an asset rather than an obstacle, where my experiences were valued rather than dismissed, where my perspective was sought rather than avoided. 6 months after starting at the Foundation, I received an unexpected email from someone I hadn't thought about in years. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen had been my executive officer during my deployment to Syria, a brilliant logistics coordinator who had left active duty to pursue a doctoral degree in international relations. She was now teaching at Georgetown University and working as a defense policy consultant. Her email was brief but intriguing. Sophia, I've been following your work with the Ashford Foundation, and I'm impressed with what you've accomplished. I'm putting together a panel discussion on veteran transition challenges for a defense policy conference next month. Would you be interested in participating? The audience will include senior Defense Department officials, congressional staff, and representatives from major veteran service organizations. I accepted immediately. The conference was exactly the kind of forum where my experience and insights could make a real difference in policy discussions that affected military families nationwide. More importantly, it was another step away from the small, judgmental world I had grown up in and toward the larger community of people who understood the value of service. The conference took place at a hotel in Arlington, Virginia, just across the river from the Pentagon, where my career had begun decades earlier. As I sat on the panel with other veteran advocates and policy experts discussing the challenges facing transitioning service members and their families, I realized how far I had traveled from the angry, defensive person I had been just months earlier. I was no longer fighting for recognition from people who were incapable of giving it. Instead, I was working alongside people who shared my values and understood my mission. I was no longer trying to justify my choices to people who would never appreciate them. Instead, I was making those choices matter in ways that had concrete, measurable impact on the lives of people who needed support. During the lunch break, a woman approached me with a familiar face but a name I couldn't immediately place. She was wearing a navy blue suit with a small American flag pin on her lapel, and her bearing suggested military background. Colonel Castellano, I'm Congresswoman Martinez from the House Armed Services Committee. I wanted to thank you for your presentation this morning. Your insights on military spouse employment challenges were particularly valuable. As we shook hands, I recognized her from news coverage of congressional hearings on defense issues. She was one of the few veterans serving in Congress, a former Army officer who had transitioned to politics after retiring as a major. Thank you, Congresswoman. It's an honor to meet you. The honor is mine. I read your testimony from the Senate hearing on veteran housing assistance, and I was impressed with your practical recommendations. We need more voices like yours in these policy discussions. We talked for 20 minutes about legislation she was developing to expand support for military families, and she asked if I would be willing to serve as an informal advisor on the veteran services aspects of the bill. The conversation was substantive, respectful, and focused on solving real problems that affected real people. As I flew back to Miami that evening, I reflected on the contrast between this interaction and virtually every conversation I had ever had with my family about my career. Congresswoman Martinez sought out my opinion because she valued my expertise. She listened carefully to my suggestions because she respected my experience.
She had asked for my continued input because she recognized my insights as valuable contributions to important work. None of that respect had required extensive explanation or justification on my part. None of it had needed to be earned through elaborate demonstrations of worthiness. It had simply been offered as a professional courtesy to someone whose background and accomplishments were self-evidently valuable. The following week brought news that would have once sent me into a spiral of complicated emotions, but now barely registered as noteworthy. Natalie called to inform me that our parents were hosting a large holiday party, their annual Christmas gathering that had always been more social performance than family celebration. "I know things have been difficult between you and the family," she said carefully, "but Mom specifically asked me to invite you. She wants to try to rebuild things." "I appreciate the thought, Natalie, but I have other commitments that evening." "Sophia, it's been almost 8 months. Don't you think it's time to try to move past this?" The question was asked with genuine concern, and I realized that Natalie, alone among my family members, had never actively participated in the dismissal of my career. She had never been enthusiastic about it, but she had also never been openly contemptuous. She was simply caught in the middle of a conflict she didn't fully understand. "Natalie, I have moved past it. I've moved past hoping for approval from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. I've moved past trying to earn respect from people who measure worth by standards I'll never meet and wouldn't want to meet if I could." "But there are parents, Sophia, and Veronica's our sister. Family should mean something." "You're absolutely right. Family should mean something. It should mean unconditional support for each other's dreams and goals. It should mean celebrating each other's achievements regardless of whether they fit your personal preferences. It should mean showing up for each other during important moments instead of excluding each other because you're embarrassed." I paused, choosing my words carefully because Natalie genuinely didn't deserve the anger I felt toward the rest of our family. The fact that our family hasn't meant those things for the past 22 years isn't something I can fix by attending a Christmas party and pretending everything is fine. What would it take, Sophia? What would they need to do to repair this relationship? The question was fair, and it deserved an honest answer. They would need to acknowledge that they were wrong, not just about the wedding, but about 22 years of treating my service as something to be ashamed of. They would need to demonstrate genuine understanding of why their behavior was hurtful, not just apologize for the consequences. They would need to show consistent respect for my choices going forward, not just temporary politeness motivated by guilt. And if they did those things, Natalie, they're not going to do those things. They're not capable of that level of self-reflection or genuine change. And I'm no longer interested in waiting around hoping they'll become different people. So,
you're just giving up on us completely? I'm not giving up on anything. I'm choosing to invest my emotional energy in relationships that are based on mutual respect and genuine appreciation. I'm choosing to spend my time with people who value what I've accomplished rather than people who wish I had accomplished something else entirely. After we hung up, I realized that the conversation hadn't left me feeling angry or sad or frustrated. It had simply felt like closing a book I had finished reading, setting it aside to make room for new stories that were more interesting and relevant to who I was becoming. 2 weeks later, on the evening of my parents' Christmas party, I was attending a different kind of gathering entirely. The foundation was hosting a holiday celebration for military families served by our programs, and I was helping coordinate activities for children whose parents were deployed overseas. The hotel ballroom was decorated with red, white, and blue streamers instead of expensive floral arrangements. The tables were filled with military spouses, veteran families, and service members on leave, rather than socialites and business leaders. The conversations focused on deployment schedules, career transitions, and children's school achievements rather than stock portfolios and vacation homes. As I helped a 6-year-old boy video chat with his father stationed in Germany, watching his face light up when his dad appeared on the screen, I thought about the contrast between this gathering and the one happening across town. Here, surrounded by people who understood sacrifice and service, who valued substance over style, who measured success by the positive impact they had on other people's lives, I was exactly where I belonged. Governor Ashford found me during the evening as I was helping clean up after the children's activities had concluded. "Sophia, excellent work tonight. This kind of event is exactly why the foundation exists." "Thank you, sir. It's incredibly rewarding work." "I wanted to let you know that the board has approved your proposal for the Military Spouse Professional Development Program. We'll be announcing it officially next month, but I thought you should know that your vision is going to help thousands of families." The program I had designed would provide grants, mentorship, and networking opportunities for military spouses pursuing advanced degrees or professional certifications. It was based on my understanding of the unique challenges facing families who moved frequently, dealt with deployment separations, and often sacrificed career opportunities for military service. "That's wonderful news, Governor. I'm grateful for the board's support." "The support is well-deserved. Your work here has been exceptional, and the foundation has benefited enormously from your leadership." As he walked away to mingle with other guests, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with external validation and everything to do with internal alignment. I was doing work that mattered, with people who appreciated my contributions, in service of values that I genuinely believed in. My phone buzzed with a text message from Veronica. "Hope you're having a wonderful holiday. We missed you at the party tonight." I looked at the message for a moment, then deleted it without responding. Their missing me was a consequence of their choices, not my responsibility to fix. I had spent too many years trying to earn a place at tables where I wasn't welcomed and wasn't valued. Now I was building my own tables, surrounded by people who were grateful for my presence rather than embarrassed by my presence. 6 months later, I received a phone call that brought unexpected news. My father had suffered a heart attack and was in the hospital. Natalie, calling from the cardiac care unit, was crying as she delivered the information. "The doctors say he's stable now, but it was serious, Sophia. Mom is falling apart, and Veronica's trying to handle everything, but she's overwhelmed. Could you please come? Just for a few days? We really need you." I sat in my office looking out at the bay, processing the complex emotions that came with this kind of family crisis. Despite everything that had happened, despite the months of separation and the fundamental disagreements about values and respect, he was still my father. The man who raised me, provided for me, and loved me in his limited way. "Which hospital?" "Miami General, room 412 in cardiac care." "I'll be there in an hour." The drive to the hospital felt strange, like returning to a country I had once lived in but no longer considered home. I hadn't seen any of them since the parking garage conversation with Veronica almost a year earlier, and I had no idea what to expect from this encounter. I found the cardiac care unit easily and spotted my family clustered around a small waiting area near the nurses' station. My mother looked older than I remembered, her usually perfect appearance disheveled with worry. Veronica was pacing, talking rapidly on her phone to someone about medical decisions and insurance coverage. Natalie was sitting in a plastic chair, looking lost and frightened. When they saw me walking toward them in my business suit, having come directly from a foundation board meeting, their reactions were mixed. Relief, gratitude, awkwardness, and something that might have been shame. "Sophia," my mother said, standing quickly, "thank you for coming. I know things have been difficult between us, but I'm so grateful you're here."
How is he? Stable, but the doctors want to do surgery tomorrow to clear blocked arteries. He's been asking for you. That surprised me. During our last conversation, he had seemed more frustrated than concerned about our estrangement. But facing mortality had a way of clarifying what actually mattered versus what people thought should matter. Can I see him? Room 412. He's awake but groggy from the medications. I walked down the hall to his room, steeling myself for what might be an emotionally complicated conversation. I found him connected to various monitors, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen him. When he saw me enter, his face brightened considerably. "Sophia, you came!" "Of course I came, Dad. You're my father." "I wasn't sure you would. After everything that's happened, all the things we said." I pulled a chair close to his bed and sat down. "Dad, we may disagree about a lot of things, but I've never stopped loving you. I just stopped trying to earn your approval." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. When he spoke again, his voice was weaker than usual. "I was wrong, Sophia, about your career, about your service, about what you chose to do with your life. I was proud of you, but I was too stubborn to say it. Too caught up in what other people might think instead of focusing on what I actually thought." The apology was more direct and honest than anything I had expected from him, but it came with 2 decades of damage already done. "Thank you for saying that, Dad. It means something to hear it. Can you forgive me? Can we try to rebuild what we lost?" I looked at this man who had raised me, who had worked hard to provide for his family, who had loved us in the only way he knew how, and I felt a complex mixture of sadness and acceptance. "Dad, I can forgive you, but I can't go back to hoping you'll become someone you're not. I can't go back to trying to fit into a family dynamic that requires me to minimize who I am for everyone else's comfort." "I understand. I think I finally understand." We talked for another hour, carefully avoiding the topics that had caused so much pain, and focusing instead on his recovery, his treatment plan, and my work with the foundation. It wasn't the relationship we might have had under different circumstances, but it was honest and peaceful in a way our interactions hadn't been for years. Over the next 3 days, as he recovered from successful surgery, I spent time with my family in a way that felt fundamentally different from our previous interactions. There were no attempts to change me, no suggestions that I should consider different career paths, no hints that my choices had been disappointments. My mother asked genuine questions about my work with the foundation, listening to my answers with something that approached interest. Veronica shared updates about her business without the competitive edge that had always characterized our conversations. Natalie seemed relieved that the family crisis had brought temporary peace rather than additional conflict. On my final day there, as my father was preparing to be discharged, he asked to speak with me privately. "Sophia, I want you to know that I've been thinking about what you said, about not trying to earn approval that should have been given freely." "Dad, let me finish. You were right. You should never have had to earn our respect for serving your country. You should never have had to justify choosing duty over comfort. You should never have had to prove that your sacrifices mattered." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I don't know if we can fix what's been broken between us, but I want you to know that I'm proud of who you've become, not because someone else told me I should be, but because I finally took the time to really understand what you've accomplished." "Thank you for saying that, Dad. It means more than you know." "Will you stay in touch? Will you let us be part of your life, even if it's different from how it used to be?" I considered the question carefully. The anger was gone. The desperate need for their validation was gone. The painful hope that they would change was gone. What remained was the possibility of a relationship based on acceptance rather than expectation, on respect rather than approval, on who we actually were rather than who we wished each other could be. Yes, Dad, I'll stay in touch, but it's going to be on terms that work for both of us, not terms that require me to pretend to be someone I'm not. I wouldn't want it any other way. As I drove back to my life in Miami, back to my work with the foundation, and my community of people who understood service and sacrifice, I realized something fundamental had shifted. Not in my relationship with my family, which would always be limited by their capacity for understanding, but in my relationship with myself. I no longer needed their approval because I had finally, completely, given myself permission to value my own choices. I no longer needed their recognition because I was surrounded by people who offered it freely and genuinely. I no longer needed their acceptance because I had accepted myself fully and without reservation. The girl who had enlisted in the Marines at 18, desperate to prove herself worthy of respect, had finally grown into a woman who knew her worth wasn't subject to other people's opinions. The daughter who had spent decades trying to earn love that should have been unconditional had finally learned to love herself unconditionally. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation that made me smile. Marcus, my assistant at the foundation, was marrying his longtime partner, and they had asked me to officiate the ceremony. As a retired military officer, I was legally qualified to perform weddings, and they wanted someone who understood the value of commitment and service to help them begin their marriage. Standing before their families and friends, surrounded by a community of veterans and military supporters who celebrated love in all its forms, I thought about the contrast with my sister's wedding 2 years earlier. This ceremony was about two people choosing each other, not about social status or political connections. It was about commitment and partnership, not about image and appearances. As I pronounced them married and watched them kiss while their families cheered, I realized that I had finally found my place in the world, not as the disappointing daughter who had chosen the wrong path, but as a respected leader who had chosen service over comfort, integrity over approval, and substance over style. Later that evening, at the reception held in a simple community center decorated with flowers from the farmer's market, I received a text message from Veronica. It was a photo of her and James at some charity function, both of them smiling at the camera in formal evening wear. The message read, "Thinking of you tonight. Hope you're well." I looked at the photo for a moment, then at the celebration happening around me. Veterans and their families were dancing to music played by a DJ who had donated his services, eating cake made by a military spouse who ran a small bakery business, celebrating love and commitment in a way that was authentic and joyful rather than performative and image-conscious. I texted back, "I am very well. Thank you for thinking of me." And I was. I was exactly where I belonged, with exactly the people who valued what I had to offer, doing exactly the work that mattered to me. It had taken 45 years and a complete reimagining of what family meant, but I had finally found my home.